Okay, so dyslexia, that's the topic, and we're going to talk about specifically, we're going to talk right from the basics. What is dyslexia? Then we're going to discuss how is dyslexia diagnosed, how can you be involved in diagnosing dyslexia in your classroom, and then the most important thing, right? How can we help the dyslexic reader become a better reader? What kinds of strategies can we use in our classroom to help those readers? And so that's kind of where we're going with this. But I want to hear from you first. What do you already know about dyslexia? Who's going to talk to me? What do you already know about it?
It's not just letters being flipped.
That's very important, and we're going to talk about that. It's not just letters being flipped. What else do you know about dyslexia?
It's the processing of the brain.
Yes. Right, it's a processing disorder. What else do you know? How many of you know students who you suspect or you know for sure struggle with dyslexia? Okay. How many of you know a family member that struggles with dyslexia? Okay. So it's a very, very common reading problem. It's very common. So what do you want to know? You're here. We've got 50 minutes. What are you looking forward to? What are you curious about? What do you want to learn more about when it comes to dyslexic and struggling readers? Strategies. How-tos. Yep. Identification. How do I know? How can I help to identify? Yep. Anything else? All right. Yes?
How to handle multiple types of dyslexia
Okay.
in one child.
Okay. All right. Well, we should probably get started then. And the first thing I'm going to do is show you a video that I just think is very, very helpful. And I'm so thankful for the kind people who got it working. So let me see if I can do this. We're going to make it bigger, and I'm going to drag it, they say. Well, no, I'm going to make it smaller. So it might be small on your screen, but you'll still hear it. Here we go. Oh, I can do it from here. All right. All right.
Take a moment to read the following. How was that? Frustrating? Slow? What were those sentences about? They're actually a simulation of the experience of dyslexia, designed to make you decode each word. Those with dyslexia experience that laborious pace every time they read. When most people think of dyslexia, they think of seeing letters and words backwards, like seeing B as D and vice versa. Or they might think people with dyslexia see saw as was. The truth is, people with dyslexia see things the same way as everyone else. Dyslexia is caused by a phonological processing problem, meaning people affected by it have trouble not with seeing language, but with manipulating it. For example, if you heard the word cat and then someone asked you, remove the C, what word would you have left? At. This can be difficult for those with dyslexia. Given a word in isolation like fantastic, students with dyslexia need to break the word into parts to read it. Fan, tas, tick. Time spent decoding makes it hard to keep up with peers and gain sufficient comprehension. Spelling words phonetically like S-T-I-K for stick and F-R-E-N-S for friends is also common. These difficulties are more widespread and varied than commonly imagined. Dyslexia affects up to 1 in 5 people. It occurs on a continuum. One person might have mild dyslexia, while the next person has a profound case of it. Dyslexia also runs in families. It's common to see one family member who has trouble spelling, while another family member has severe difficulty decoding even one-syllable words like catch. The continuum and distribution of dyslexia suggest a broader principle to bear in mind as we look at how the brains of those with dyslexia process language. Neurodiversity is the idea that because all our brains show differences in structure and function, we shouldn't be so quick to label every deviation from the norm as a pathological disorder, or dismiss people living with these variations as defective. People with neurobiological variations like dyslexia, including such creative and inventive individuals as Picasso, Muhammad Ali, Whoopi Goldberg, Steven Spielberg, and Cher, clearly have every capacity to be brilliant and successful in life. So here's the special way the brains of those with dyslexia work. The brain is divided into two hemispheres. The left hemisphere is generally in charge of language and ultimately reading, while the right typically handles spatial activities. fMRI studies have found that the brains of those with dyslexia rely more on the right hemisphere and frontal lobe than the brains of those without it. This means when they read a word, it takes a longer trip through their brain and can get delayed in the frontal lobe. Because of this neurobiological glitch, they read with more difficulty. But those with dyslexia can physically change their brain and improve their reading. With an intensive multisensory intervention that breaks the language down and teaches the reader to decode based on syllable types and spelling rules, the brains of those with dyslexia begin using the left hemisphere more efficiently while reading, and their reading improves. The intervention works because it locates dyslexia appropriately as a functional variation in the brain, which naturally shows all sorts of variations from one person to another. Neurodiversity emphasizes this spectrum of brain function in all humans and suggests that to better understand the perspectives of those around us, we should try to not only see the world through their eyes, but understand it through their brains.
That's helpful, isn't it? Isn't that a helpful video? It really shows a little bit more about what's going on with the dyslexic learner. So dyslexia is a specific kind of reading difficulty. It's kind of an umbrella term. It's for reading difficulty. A dyslexics is a specific kind of reading difficulty. Despite average to above average intelligence, children with dyslexia have difficulty learning to decode or read words by associating sounds and letters or letter combinations. They have difficulty recognizing sight words or frequently occurring words that most readers can identify. So it's average or above average intelligence. Remember that, because that's very important. Children with dyslexia have difficulty learning how to spell, and sometimes this is called encoding. So think about it. If you have difficulty with sounds and processing, then having to get that down onto paper and kind of reverse the order can be very difficult. People with dyslexia have weak phonemic awareness. Okay, now help me out with a little bit. What are we talking about when we talk about phonemic awareness? Yes. Even before phonics, because phonics has to do with associating the written letter with the sound. So even before that, phonemic awareness has to do with sounds. It is the foundation of literacy, phonemic awareness, being able to hear and manipulate sounds. It takes longer for people with dyslexia to process phonemic information or to make a connection between sounds and letters. So they've really identified that the core issue for most dyslexics is their inability to hear and manipulate sounds. Now they can hear it, but it doesn't get processed correctly. And so that's foundational. Think about learning to read. Before you can get to your letters and learning to read with phonics, you have to be able to hear sounds in the spoken word. So how many of you are preschool teachers? You spend most of your day just playing with words, don't you? You read words, you do rhymes, you do a lot of rhyming games, all because you know that the very first step is to first be able to hear and manipulate sounds. Then we go and we put letters to it. So we call the issue that many people think that dyslexics struggle with the phonological model. And in this model, the phoneme is the fundamental element of the language system. And for dyslexics, the phonemes are less well developed. So for a lot of the students in your class, they're going along with the rhyming games and they're able to play, but there just seems to be that one student who just is not able to rhyme words. Well, that should be a little bit of a warning sign. Dyslexics perceive words as a blur. So if they're looking at a blur or a word, it's kind of a blur to them. Whereas a good reader looks at a word, and then what do? They break it down into the sounds that those parts of the word make. They don't have an appreciation for the underlying segments, the parts, or the phonemes. So let's do a little practice, some phoneme practice. I'll give you a word, and you'll tell me how many phonemes are in that word. Those are the individual sounds. We'll start easy. So the easiest word that we always start with is what? Cat, right? How many phonemes in cat?
3.
Right. Same with me. At. How many phonemes in potato?
5.
We got 5. We got 6. Let's do a show of hands, and we'll just go with that. How many say 5? How many say 6? All right, we'll go with 6. How about chase? A 3. How many letters in chase? How many sounds, phonemes? 3. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about phonemes, those individual sounds that most of you were able to hear and determine as we went about it. Well, for the dyslexic, it's different. It's sort of like looking at this brick wall. When you and I look at this brick wall, we see individual bricks, right? When a good reader looks at a word, they can break it down into its individual parts and the sounds it makes. But when the dyslexic looks at the word, it's sort of like this. All the bricks are blurred together. Oh, well, that's why they struggle, right? They can't manipulate those individual sounds. So if I'm asking them to read a brand new word that they have not committed to sight memory, it's not that they're not following the phonics rules that you've taught them. It's that they can't even get to that part because they can't hear, discriminate those individual sounds in the words, okay? So for the dyslexic reader, looking at a word is like looking at a brick wall and not seeing the bricks. Where for us, as readers, we can distinguish those bricks, okay? So that's what's going on with that dyslexic learner. It's a phonological processing disorder that God designed them with. They're perfectly and wondrously made. And that's a message that we want to get across to those students too. Here's something interesting. I just watched a video. What's the name of the Fonz? Harry Winkler? Is that his name? Henry, thank you. Henry Winkler has dyslexia. But he was doing this video, and they've done some tests now with newborn babies. And they'll get a newborn baby, and they'll hook it up with things on their head, you know, the things, the sensors. And they'll say the letter P and B. And then they record the information. And they notice that even at that sound, or at that level, the babies can distinguish the difference between a P and a B. Now, I don't know what they're looking at necessarily, but they also then hypothesize, and they're starting to build research, that even at that early age, that is something that they're born with, the inability to hear sounds. And that we could tell even from a newborn, possibly, if they're going to struggle a little bit with dyslexia. Now, if we can intervene early, that's best, right? And we're going to talk about that. I don't suggest that we all, you gotta give birth, now hook them up. All right, that's not what I'm suggesting, but I'm suggesting that this is something that God designed them with, and this is something that we can work with as teachers and help them with. All right, so speaking, how many of you can speak? Speaking is a natural process. And you put a baby in a room surrounded by people who are speaking the mother tongue, they will learn to speak. That's the way God's designed it. Speaking is a natural process. Reading is not a natural process. It's a man-made invention. So it's not natural. When we learn to read, we are actually building new pathways in our brain that never existed before. So reading can, for most people, be a fairly easy process, but for some people, it's very, very difficult. Readers have to, in order to read, break the code. So what is the code? Well, the first part of the code is realizing that the spoken words have parts. Now, all of us, we're way beyond this now, because when I just asked you to hear the individual parts of a word, the phonemes, it was kind of a little bit hard, wasn't it? Because you're beyond this, you've mastered this. But for the new reader, the very first thing they have to do is be able to realize that the spoken word has parts. Then we go to the second part of the reading code. Those individual spoken parts, or phonemes, are represented by letters, right? So then we start linking those sounds that they've learned to manipulate in your wonderful classes where you're playing with words to the letters that represent them. What's the next part of the code? Letters then are no longer just these meaningless scribbles on the paper. Suddenly they're starting to say, something's going on here, I get it. Those sounds are linked to letters and they have meaning. Letters linked to phonemes are processed automatically in the language system. That's an automatic process once it's learned, right? You don't have to, when you read something, slow yourself down and say, A says like an apple. Okay, I got that word. No, you've got that. It's automatic now. The reading code at that point is deciphered. Once we are able to put the sounds with the letters and then the letters with the words, then we've broken the code. Now, where did we say that the dyslexic struggles from the very first part? What part of the code? Number 1. They struggle with the very, very first part of it. And so we need to realize that phonemic awareness is the key. That's the starting point. A phonemic weakness at the lowest level of language system impairs decoding. Do you see what we mean by that? We've got phonology down here at the bottom, and that's phonemic awareness. That's what's necessary for decoding, okay? It's the lowest level. Then we have semantics and syntax and discourse, which are all necessary for comprehension. So a dyslexic learner has everything they need to read. They understand semantics and syntax. They often have very good comprehension, but there's a missing part, and it's key. It's their phonemic awareness, the phonology. They can't decode. Okay, they've got everything else they need. So what do? Well, take a look, and we saw a little bit of this in the video. We've got neuroimaging, an MRI, and we've got a typical reader's brain versus a dyslexic reader's. Very different, right? Did you know that they could also hook our children up and give them MRIs, and we could see what's going on in the brain, and the neuroimaging would give us clues as to whether they struggle with dyslexia. So in the typical reader, we've got a very efficient process going on in the brain. Very efficient. In the dyslexic reader, it's not efficient at all. It's laborious. It's difficult. I live in Wisconsin, and we live about 45 minutes, an hour from Milwaukee. If I want to go to Milwaukee, I get in my car, and I go to the interstate, I-94, and I hop on the interstate, and I get there. Very efficient, right? It's not, if it's, I don't know, is it up to 70? 70. Sometimes there's traffic. There's traffic. How many of you live in a place where they've been doing construction for 15 years? Yeah, that's kind of how Milwaukee is these days. But it's relatively efficient. I get on the interstate and I go. I live in Wisconsin. It's farming country. We have a lot of back roads. I could get to Milwaukee by getting on the country roads and weaving around, and I could maybe eventually get there. Slow, laborious, inefficient. That's like reading for the dyslexic student. It's very slow and laborious because they don't have an efficient way of processing sounds and letters. So it's very difficult. It's very hard. So when we talk about diagnosing dyslexia, we can go through the official channels. How many of you have been involved in going through the official channels of getting someone diagnosed with dyslexia? Okay, several of you. So sometimes that is through the public school system, where they test the child and they talk to their teachers and they're involved in that way. Sometimes it's through a psychologist, a school psychologist. There are different methods. And what we're talking about here is how you as a teacher can start to diagnose that something's going on so that you can refer the student later to a specialist to get an official diagnosis. And we call this model the sea of strength model. Remember I said that the dyslexics usually have average or above average intelligence? And remember how I said that they have everything they need in order to read well except for the phonological awareness. So we have a sea of strength model. So we take a look at our student and we say, you know, that student's comprehension is pretty good. When I read them a story, they understand, or when they hear a story read to them, they're even able to infer things and read between the lines. Their general knowledge is good. They're a really bright kid. Problem solving. They solve problems like nobody else, or they're really good with problem solving. Vocabulary is good. Critical thinking, reasoning, concept formation. But they still can't read very well. They can't decode. When I have a student like that in my classroom, I should say, I wonder if this child is dyslexic. They seem to have all of these strengths, a sea of strengths, just this one weakness. I wonder if this child is dyslexic. That's how you as a teacher can be involved in this process right from the beginning, where you're watching for flags, red flags, where you're watching for indicators, where you're saying, wow, this child has so much going for them, but they just can't decode. So we call that the C of strength. What does a successful reading program look like for the dyslexic child? Well, first of all, it identifies. What's it going to identify? It's going to identify a weakness in getting to the sounds of words. We used the rhyming example a little bit ago. Those of you, let me see again, preschool, kindergarten. So you're playing these rhyming games, and maybe you've actually had this experience or can picture the child's face in your head right now. Let's say you've got a ball, and you're going to pass the ball to the child, and they're supposed to give you a rhyming word back. And it can be nonsense. So we say bag, and I pass it to you. Heidi, I pass it to you, and you'd say? Sang. And then she'd pass it to someone, and you'd say? Rain. And then you'd pass it, and you get to that child, and they can't think of it. And you say, come on, give us a rhyming word. And they can't. Then you move on to another game, and you're playing a rhyming game, and it's that same child again. Well, it's just pre-K, maybe they'll develop into it. That's a warning sign. If everybody else seems to be able to rhyme, and that child can't, little warning bells should go off where I'm going to take a look, and I'm going to work with this child. A reading program is also successful when we look at the strengths in their thinking and their reasoning. So we're not just going to focus on their difficulty in decoding. We're going to find the strengths that they can do. We're going to focus on those and their abilities and their ability to reason. A successful reading program, early help for the weakness. When we have a problem with rhyming, right away we're going to stop and work with that child with rhyming. And then we're going to give accommodations to help access the strengths. And we'll talk about this a little later, about accommodations and how we can accommodate those children who are struggling in our classes. So, what are some early clues to dyslexia? And it would be interesting if we had time to go around and hear what you have discovered as you've worked with students who you suspect have dyslexia. Well, first, there's often a delay in speaking. Remember, the sounds are sometimes hard. So sometimes that child has a delay in speaking right from the beginning. They have difficulties in pronunciation. Baby talk that continues long past everyone else who has stopped baby talk. So leaving off the beginning sounds of words, like it says lelephant instead of elephant. So we're beginning to leave off sounds. Inverting sounds within a word. Aminal for animal. We're going to pay attention to this. Then there's some examples here. There's no spaghetti up there. A lot of people mispronounce spaghetti for a long time, don't they? But these are examples of, okay, so when they're speaking to me, I'm hearing that they're like manipulating words, or they're glossing over sounds. They can't hear the little individual sounds in words. Trouble with rhyming games and insensitivity to rhyme seems to be a problem. So as the child gets older, they often use words that lack specificity, like stuff. Have you ever had a child that uses stuff all the time? One of my boys, I have 3 boys, and one of my boys uses stuff in every story he tells me. You're like, yeah, tell me more. Yeah, what word besides stuff? But that should be something to pay attention to if they are having difficulty accessing words. Sentences hard to follow because they're filled with pronouns and words like stuff. Difficulty producing a word on command. Given a choice, can almost always recognize the correct word. So this is interesting. Sometimes the dyslexic student has trouble accessing those words, okay? They just can't get it out. But if you show them the word and have them point to the right word, they can identify the correct word. Isn't that interesting? So sometimes recalling words on the spot is very, very difficult for some students. So pay attention to that as an early warning sign. And difficulty learning the names and sounds of letters. So you've been over it, and you've been over it, and you've been over it, and they're still not remembering the letters and the sounds. That's an early indicator. How many of you are thinking in your head now, I know somebody like this who struggles with this? Okay, it's very, very common. And as we saw in the video, it's a spectrum. Some people have severe dyslexia, but some people, it's not quite as severe. But regardless, when you see an early warning sign, it's time to pay attention to that and really think about it. A child who has dyslexia, a dyslexic sibling or parent, should be monitored extremely closely. Have you found this to be true? Sometimes it's interesting, you'll have a child who's struggling, and with reading or decoding, and it'll come to parent-teacher conference time, and the parents come in, and you're explaining and showing work as to how the child is struggling, and mom or dad says, yeah, I struggled with that too when I was in school. Okay, well, I'm going to pay attention to that then. Between 1.25% of children born to a dyslexic parent will also be dyslexic. Okay, so that's an indicator. If one child in a family is dyslexic, almost 1/2 of his brothers and sisters are also likely to be dyslexic. Dyslexia is carried as a genetic trait. It's not a guaranteed thing that if your mom or dad has dyslexia that you'll have dyslexia, but it's something that we as teachers, trained professionals, we're going to be alert to and we're going to pay attention to. Okay, so those are some early signs and early clues. So somebody, while I open this bag of Jolly Ranchers, tell me myth number 1 up there. What is the myth? Someone read it to us.
No evidence that dyslexic children speak the letters backwards.
Yes, that's a myth. And maybe you came in, I'm going to pass these around because I'm seeing some of this and you need some sugar. So pass this around and get some sugar. All right. So how many of you came in thinking that? You don't even have to raise your hand. That's a very common myth. Oh, that child has dyslexia. They flip their letters. But that's very, very common for early readers. I talked to a mom not too long ago who was concerned about her daughter because she flipped letters. And I was able to say, well, let's just wait and see here because it's very, very common. I can personally remember having trouble with my B's and my D's, right? And so that's not necessarily something that is an indicator. No evidence that dyslexic children actually even see the letters backwards. We don't have any evidence of that. In fact, backward writing and reversals is very, very common. And first graders? First grade teachers, do you still see B's and D's? Yeah. And you probably already know that. It's not something to necessarily become alarmed at quite yet. Here are some later clues to dyslexia. Let's say they've gone through pre-K, kindergarten, first grade, and they're older now. What are some older kind of students? How does it look for them? Well, we have a failure to understand that words come apart. So we're struggling with that. They just see words as a whole chunk and they can't break them down and see that they come apart. Now, yeah, we got to make sure this first row gets some Jolly Ranchers. A lack of strategy to read new words. Need many more exposures. So while the other class is going on and they've got the words, a dyslexic student needs more and more exposures, right? To master that word, to get it into their sight vocabulary, because that's what they're doing. Instead of decoding, many times they're just trying to get it all into their memory, into their sight vocabulary. So they need many, many exposures to those words. A reliance on context. I said earlier that dyslexic children often have really good comprehension because they're often very good with context clues. So they read the passage, and you may even listen to them read aloud, and whoa, it's laborious, but they get to the end and they understood what they read, because they usually learn as a coping skill to use the context clues, which makes number 5 difficult. Difficulties reading the little words, the A's and the on and the and that and and. So because you can't determine this stuff from context clues, can you? No. So sometimes that's hard for them. And then here's the thing. Complaints about how hard reading is. It's hard. And you know what? It is hard. It's very hard on their brains. I could imagine that their brains actually hurt with that processing. It's hard on them emotionally. Everyone else gets it. I don't get it. Why is it hard for me? Why is I'm such a slow reader? It's hard on their families. It's hard on their moms and their dads who are working with them in the evenings, trying to get them up to speed, trying to help them along. So these complaints about how hard reading is, listen to them. It's not necessarily just laziness. It could be that when they say that reading is hard, what they mean is reading's really hard, and they're having trouble decoding and struggling. What do you watch for? First grade students. As students begin to read aloud, listen to the errors they're making. Do the errors show that the child is trying, although sometimes imperfectly, to link the letters with the sounds? So, I could tell that they try to sound out that word. Or, when you look at the errors that they're making, does it seem to show an utter lack of understanding of the letters and sounds? Are they just guessing? I'm going to pay attention to that. What I want to see in the errors is that they're making an attempt to link the letters with the sounds. Now, second grade, difficult sounding out syllables or words that have many syllables to it. Specifically, not sounding out words or taking wild stabs at words. Not able to read new or unfamiliar words. So when they get to an unfamiliar word where the other students have their phonics word identification strategies, these students can't tell the difference. They see words as a blur, so it's harder for them. This is what you're looking for in your first grade student and your second grade student. Third grade and beyond, look at that first one. Disastrous spelling skills. Okay, well that makes sense though, right? If I'm having trouble processing sounds and letters, and then I have to then get it out onto the paper, the letters with their sounds, I'm not going to be able to do it. How am I going to try to spell? All in a chunk, right? I'm going to try to memorize the order of the letters. Could you imagine how difficult that would be? You may be able to get away with it very early on, but as those words get longer, you can't memorize the order that those letters go in. Inability to read fluently. So you've heard these students read. It's very laborious and very slow and lacks any kind of fluency. And then there's pain. It's just hard process. So this is what you're watching for in third grade and beyond. Hopefully our goal, and we'll talk about this, is to identify early on with our pre-K and our kindergartners so we can give them the help they need. That doesn't always happen. So you get into third grade, get into high school, and you still have students who are struggling with this. Identification is the first strategy, the first way to help them. So back to our sea of strength models. We have to identify. It falls on our shoulders to identify students who are struggling. Kindergarten and first grade teachers, you have to monitor this very, very carefully. You want to identify students who are vulnerable with dyslexia. I ran across a school, I think it's in England actually, and they actually teach their kindergarten classes as if every student might possibly have dyslexia. So they do a lot of multi-sensory approach. They use a lot of strategies that are effective with dyslexic students with all of their students. It helps the other students too. They're not harmed by it. But that way we're helping those students who are maybe vulnerable for dyslexia. The wait and see approach is never the right approach. So we don't want to say, you know what, September, October, or first grade, let's wait and see how they are in January or February. If they're struggling with rhyming in first part of first grade, we stop and we work on that right away. The wait and see approach is not the right approach. Because what happens? As we wait, what happens to the gap? Show me with your hands what the gap happens. Right. And so if we can start early with early intervention, we can close that gap and get them back on track. So that's really important. So we never want to wait. Okay, so there are 3 steps in the evaluation process. We've got a student who we suspect has dyslexia. What do? Well, we want to establish a reading problem according to age and education. So we say this student is in second grade and they are still having difficulty matching their letters with their sounds. Okay, should they know that by second grade? That's the age, the education level. So first I have to establish that there's a reading problem. Number 2, I'm going to gather evidence that this is kind of an unexpected kind of problem. The student has a sea of strengths, but they're struggling here. So I've got this evidence and this evidence and this evidence. Okay, so there's something going on. And number 3, demonstrate evidence of isolated phonologic weakness with other language functions intact. So what that means is I'm going to narrow in on phonological awareness. I'm going to establish that they struggle with that. So I'm gathering my evidence. I'm pulling together a file. I'm establishing a case. That's what we're doing. Here's the good news. Praise the Lord, dyslexia is not the end of the world. Do you know who this guy is over here? On the far side? Ford. Over there. Do you know who this guy is? You know what this guy is? Who said it? History major? That's right, Woodrow Wilson. All of these individuals, they suspect struggled with dyslexia. This guy right here, Woodrow Wilson, did not learn to read until he was 14 years old. He became president of the United States. There is so much hope for the dyslexic learner. They actually say that many of the Fortune 500 CEOs have dyslexia. And they did a survey recently of entrepreneurs, and a third of the entrepreneurs that they surveyed had dyslexia. Why could you imagine that to be true? Yeah?
It's the way their brain is functioning.
Explain.
It was explained to me that if you have a stack of cards, the normal brain can classify. The dyslexic brain, it's all big mush.
Yes.
So when they try to pull it out, they say, oh, I got lost, but I can put this and this together. So they are able to
It's
do
the
what
coping
normal
things.
people cannot do.
Because of this deficit for them, they come up with coping mechanisms. So think about the perseverance that someone with dyslexia has to have every single day. Isn't that a great characteristic of someone who's in business, an entrepreneur? Think about the soft skills that we call, the relationship kind of skills. That's a really invaluable skill. Public speaking is a very valuable skill. Hard work. This is hard work. So isn't that interesting that so many really successful people struggle with dyslexia? That's a message we want to communicate. Again, we go back, God has made you with this and designed you with this, and He doesn't make mistakes, so how can we help you make the most of the strengths that He has given to you? All children can be taught to read. We have to believe that. We have to believe that. Now, the good news is, to be functioning in our society, everybody doesn't have to score 99 percentile on our Iowa Basic Skills Test, right? In order to do well in our society, we just have to be average readers, really, right? So that's the good news. We don't have to bring someone who can't read all the way over to here. We just have to get them reading competently and so that they can survive in our society. All right, here we go. How do we just help the dyslexics break the code? Rhyme, rhyme, and more rhyme. We have to play with words. We have to go back to the basics and help them discriminate between sounds of words. There are so many ideas online for this. And so use those resources that are available to you. Aren't you thankful that we have that? I remember back in school where we went to this thing called the library. And we had to pull out books. And now there's so much excellent resources. I use Reading Rockets all the time. That's my favorite reading website, Reading Rockets. And they have so many great ways that you can help students break the code when it comes to rhyming. Working on words. We have to help them learn to take a word apart. So if I give you the word water, could you segment that into its individual sounds? Okay, so that's segmenting. We have to help students learn to segment. We can do that with lots of different approaches, with helping them learn to do that. We want to help them blend words, pushing things back together again. So if I give you wa and ter, you tell me water, you blend it. We want to help them with syllables. It's interesting, that student who can't count the syllables, keep an eye on them because they maybe can't hear it. So work with them, and it's still, if you have helped them and they still have trouble with it, maybe we've got a little warning sign there. And then separating syllables into phonemes. Then we have to put it into writing. So we're going to practice reading both silently and out loud. We're going to look at sight words and sight words that don't follow the typical phonics patterns and have to be committed to memory. We're going to work with writing and spelling. Again, this is hard work. This is probably going to require help beyond the classroom teacher, right? For someone who's really struggling with dyslexia. We have to really give them intense instruction. So the first key is early intervention. The sooner, the better. If you take anything away from this, it should be early intervention. Watching for those warning signs, not neglecting them. Number two, look at that, intense instruction. This is not going to be easy. How many of you have gone through helping a dyslexic child personally, maybe a son or a daughter? Have any of you had some degree of success where you made super good progress? Yep. Were you at my last workshop like a year ago? You look really familiar. So it was a long process to help your child?
I went online and I found a Susan Barton reading.
Yes.
And I became trained as a tutor.
Very good.
It was very effective.
Yes. And so did you have instruction every day? Or help almost every day?
We did about 3 days a week. And then during the summer, I tutored her 3 days a week.
So for students who are really struggling, we're talking probably about 5 days a week, maybe even 90 minutes a day. So that's beyond the regular classroom time. So that's something to talk to parents about. Once we've identified them, once we know we've got a struggle, then we're going to have to get more tutoring help. But the good news is people can be trained to be tutors, and there's a lot of good programs out there. I saw an interesting study recently. It was a study with incarcerated youth and helping them with their reading, not necessarily dyslexia, but they saw marked growth as much as 1 reading year advancement in about 21 tutoring sessions. So that's like 3 weeks. 1 year of one-on-one tutoring. The same is true for dyslexic students. One-on-one tutoring, intense, hard work. We see really good gains from that. High quality instruction, that's where you come in. Getting trained, understanding, lots of good resources at your fingertips to help students so that you can give them that one-on-one help they need. And this is important, sufficient duration. We don't just quit when things start turning around a little bit. We stick with it. We have to have a sufficient duration. This is going to be a long period of time that we're committing to. Did your mom or dad say to you, well, nobody ever said it was going to be easy, right? Same thing's true here. It's hard work. But we know and have lots of evidence to show that with that hard work, there can be great gains to help the dyslexic learner. So what are some approaches? We call it the multisensory approach. The Orton-Gillingham is the most common approach. But multisensory means we're saying the word, so we're hearing it, we're speaking it. You know, tactile is touch, right? And tactile could be just the way that your lips touch when you say a word. So let's go back to the word potato. What do your lips do? And so tactile could just be saying that. Those kinds of things help to commit things to memory. So tactile is touch. We're going to have kinesthetics. We're going to have movement. Now, we're not going to march around the room. That's probably not going to help us with reading. But we're going to write. And we're going to have maybe a sandboard or felt board where we can write on it. That will help us. So that's what we mean by multisensory. Systematic and explicit reading instruction. Now, most of us believe in this already, right? Phonics, systematic, explicit. That is what your struggling reader needs too. Systematic, explicit instruction. We're going to assess them. We're going to see if there's progress. So if they're struggling with fluency and reading very slowly on a particular passage, I'm going to give them that passage, time it, write it down. Then I'll give them the passage the next day and see if we have any progress. Then I'll give it to them again. So we're seeing the numbers. Any math people in here? Many of you probably teach elementary, so you teach math. Okay, the numbers are important, right? The numbers tell the story. And so we want to assess and get real data. And then again, explicit phonics instruction, which most of us are already big believers in. All right, let's talk about accommodations. I love this sentence here. Accommodations are the bridge that help connect a dyslexic student to his strengths and reach his potential. Sometimes we still get a little pushback when it comes to accommodations. It's not fair to the other students. Sometimes you hear that. But accommodations are just a bridge so that the student can showcase their strengths and weaknesses. So in history, we're going to maybe read the test to them and have them give the answers orally. Then they can showcase what they already know about history. Maybe we're going to give them longer on a test so they don't feel that time crunch. Those are accommodations, not to make it unfair, but to kind of level the playing field a little bit and help them show the strengths that God has given them. So that's what we're talking about with accommodations. So another thing we're going to want to do with our students is to help them advocate for themselves. So I'm just going to touch on these really quickly, but if the problem is for the student that reading is slow and laborious, then what can I do? You guys should just tell me. Give them extra time on tests, right? What else can you do? For the student, we're going to make sure that maybe they don't have too much reading for homework on that particular night. Maybe we spread out the reading assignments. How about, is it cheating if you're in a literature class and you listen to the book on tape? What are your goals in teaching classic literature? Think about that. And can you meet those same learning goals if the student is listening to it on tape? Usually you can, because you're trying to build an appreciation, right? You're trying to see character development. All that kind of stuff can still be accomplished by listening to the book. If there's a basic problem in language for older students, maybe they don't have to take a foreign language in high school. If it's hard for them to learn English to hear the sounds, they're going to struggle with a foreign language. Help them visualize the material. Let's go down to this bottom one. Handwriting is laborious and barely legible. I'm so thankful there's so much software out there that helps students with this. So computers, laptops, have them type things out. If it's hard for them to actually write, help them use those tools on the computer that makes it easier. Again, it's just an accommodation. If they're in college or high school, maybe they can borrow someone else's notes. Maybe they can record your lectures if you're in high school and listen to those lectures. So lots of ways that we can be sensitive and help with accommodations. And then giving oral responses on the spot is slow. So you need to be aware, and I had this experience with a child. I'm going around the room trying to get oral responses, and you come to that child and they seem to freeze. Well, it's because they sometimes have difficulty accessing that word. Just be aware of that. Maybe we don't ask them to kind of deliver things on the spot. Maybe we allow them time to prepare. Learning happens best for this type of child when it's a top-down approach. They're good with the big picture, with the concepts. The facts and memorizing the facts is harder. So if we can help them with the big picture, then those facts and those memorization things can come later. So those are just some ways to accommodate. I think it's time. I have to stop here. The rest of this, I just had some ideas for software that are actually programs that are out here. I'll leave it on this. Unfortunately, and I want you to inform me if you know of one, I don't know of a Christian reading curriculum that has scientific research evidence to be effective in helping dyslexics. If you do, please tell me. I want to know about that. So this is not a Christian curriculum, but it has been proven highly effective with helping dyslexic readers, and it's called the Reading Mastery Signature Edition. I'll stop there. Your takeaways are there is hope for the dyslexic if we can identify early, and there's so many resources to help them.